Well, today we've got Jane Harrop from Poynton, who specializes in miniature making. And it'll be very self-evident from the images that she's going to show what it's about.
So thank you for inviting me to talk to you. As I was introduced, my hobby and my work is dolls' houses. So this afternoon you're having a talk on the history of dolls' houses. I must admit, I'm not quite sure how long it's going to last. So I've got plenty of other things to show you. I know I've got to talk for an hour, but I hope in that we'll have some questions. So I'm going to start off with the history of dolls' houses, and as I say, I will then go on to other things. I used to do a lot of talks many years ago, but as I got busier with the business, I had to actually stop doing the talks because I'm sat in the loft at the minute. So whenever I take anything to a talk, I've got to go down 2 flights of stairs to pack it all in the car. And then I had to come up 2 flights of stairs again when I got back to put it all away. So it's sort of got a bit difficult really, and particularly as I don't always have a good back. So when Virginia said that it was online, that was one of the things that prompted me to say, well, yes, I would do it. And also for Virginia, because she's been really good to me over the years, going through all my instructions and things when I need a bit of help. And Virginia's one of the best, aren't you, proofreading? So it's thanks to Virginia that I'm here. So starting off with the history of dolls' houses. Simple dolls' rooms and the furnishings were played with by children from the Greek and Roman civilizations, and there's evidence of this from the small objects that have been excavated in clay and bronze. They're believed to be toys, but we don't really know because obviously we don't know that far back. The Egyptians made vast quantities of models, but they were used really for the afterlife. So it's unlikely that they were played with, but it does seem likely that as the centuries progressed, they might have been a little plaything, you know, just for the children to hold. So what I would say is the first structure of a form that we'd accept as a doll's house was bought in 1558, which is quite a long time ago, isn't it, really, thinking back? And you're all into history, so you're probably able to relate, are you, to these dates that I'm going to give you? Yeah, hopefully. So 1558, Albrecht V of Bavaria bought a doll's house for his daughter. It wasn't to play with, and he actually kept it in his own art chamber. Regrettably, there's no photos of this doll's house. What we do know, though, is that it was 4 stories high with a courtyard, and it contained a dancing room and a sewing room. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by fire in 1674. So I'm going to show you now the earliest known doll's house that is in existence. So what we're saying is that the doll's house in Bavaria was the first, but a lot of them over the years, they've obviously either been destroyed or, you know, they're not actually wanted anymore. So this one is 1611. So I'm just going to share my screen with you to start showing you some photos. This is the earliest doll's house known in existence. It's 9 foot high and it's now in the Nuremberg Museum. The base, if you look at the base, that's a cellar. The first floor consists of great hall decorated with a mural showing a picnic of a garden. And there's a staircase which leads up to the second floor, and there's a kitchen filled with cooking utensils. On the top floor, can you see there's a canopied bed? So you can see that it's quite full of furnishings and accessories, and that's all the way back to 1611, which I think is quite amazing, really, when you think how many centuries that is ago, you know, and you can look how small and detailed everything is. You can actually see that the rooms are housed in a cabinet, and that's why German dolls' houses are often referred to as cabinet houses. The museum at Nuremberg is famous for its collection of the early dolls' houses. So you're talking about these dolls' houses back to 1600s and upwards. So the only other earliest German cabinet outside Europe is actually in the Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood in London, and that's an early 4-bedroom cabinet house, which is inscribed with the date of 1673. So if you're into dolls' houses, and after this talk you actually want to go and see the earliest doll's house that we have in this country, you'd need to take a trip down to London. If you haven't already been to the Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood, it is absolutely a wonderful day out, and you can just get the underground straight there. I had a memorable trip many years ago, but it was absolutely fascinating. And the way they display the dolls' houses, they're literally all behind glass, floor to ceiling, so that you can see everything. Some of the museums that you do go to, you do actually find that you're looking through sort of like a little window just to see the tiny dolls' houses. So the fact that you can see all the dolls' houses in the glory is amazing. I'm just going to show you photo 2. So photo 2 is an example of an early cabinet house from Germany, another earlier example. And it shows, if you actually look inside, some of the scales of the pieces vary. If you look down below, can you see there's something that looks like a wheelbarrow at the bottom? That looks very big compared to everything else. And the problem, obviously, with these cabinet houses is that they were made for the very rich. If you were poor, you couldn't afford them. You were obviously making them for an adult, even though, as I said, first of all, Albrecht bought his doll's house for his daughter. They were actually made to be shown to the children, but they were collectible by the adults. So when you read all the information on this, one of the words that comes out is lavishly decorated and furnished. And a lot of the furnishings were made by craftsmen who made these items in full size, and they were actually asked to reproduce them down in miniature. Now, the thing is, we actually work in 1/12 scale in England, and it's presumed, there's nothing really actually said about the scale that they worked in, so I presume that it was 1/12 scale, which means an inch equals a foot, and I'll go on to that a little bit later. But obviously these scales mean different things to different people, and even though these craftsmen may have been the best in the business, if they start working on something and it's perhaps a little bit bigger, they're not going to stop and think, oh, they wouldn't have thought that's not one true 12th scale. They probably would have just carried on. So if you do look a little bit closely, you can see that some things are a little bit out of scale. The Dutch and German craze for assembling the small objects in collectors' cabinets spread to England in the early 18th century. Over here, they're actually known as baby houses, not cabinet houses. And that is because they very much were interested in the facade of the doll's house, which were replicas of buildings in England. So whereas the cabinet houses just had 2 doors that mostly closed, or maybe a bit of a facade, obviously the English baby houses were well known for their architectural finish, if that makes sense. So let me just go on to number 3. So this photograph is the oldest English doll's house that we have, and that is Anne Sharp's house, who lived in Norfolk, and it was preserved more or less as it is. It was given to her by Queen Anne, and Anne Sharp was actually her goddaughter. Sorry about that. I've got lots of notes here. I'm just trying to keep up to with what I've written. The house stands at 5 feet 9, so that's quite tall, isn't it? Goodness knows she would have had to have had a big house to put it in, regardless of the size of the doll's house. And it had 9 rooms and an attic. And even though the house is very simply furnished, it gives a glimpse as to how family life was in that period, which I think if you look at the bottom photo, that looks like it was absolutely quite stunning. The only thing is, I was under the impression that it was the front of it was as a house, but that's obviously more as a cabinet house, isn't it, like they had in Germany. So I've got some more photos for you a little bit later on that will actually show the facade of English houses. I read in some of the books that when the people were being made for these dolls' houses, they thought that it was suitable that wood was used for servants and the family was made of wax. So that just goes to show how the hierarchy, obviously many years ago, that still sort of carries on today, but obviously in dolls' houses the dolls are all made of porcelain nowadays, or clay. But I thought that was quite interesting. There's quite a lot of fine examples of our early houses, but a lot of the photos that I had in the books are not really suitable. They actually came out very tiny and probably wouldn't have shown so well on screen. You'd be if you are interested in dolls' houses, there's the Nostell Priory Dolls House, which is National Trust. And that is an absolutely, have you, I don't know when the pictures have gone.
Click on share screen again.
Oh, there we are. Sorry, I think I got the stop share screen. So this is a fabulous representation of a doll's house made in the 1730s, and that is quite stunning, isn't it? And you can actually see, I know you can't see the front of it, but that is obviously a proper doll's house, or a baby house as they were known in Britain. So if I scroll that, can you see a little bit clearly what I'm showing you? Look at the staircase. That's absolutely wonderful, isn't it? The staircase, absolutely amazing. And again, that's going back to the 1730s. So I think as you think about this, it's quite amazing the skills that everybody had all those centuries ago, and we're actually quite happy to take them down the scales and to fill a doll's house. And you know yourself that to make a full-size piece of furniture takes a long time. And Anne and Virginia, who do the miniatures classes with me, knows how long it takes to make a replica of a full-size piece of furniture, and that is very time consuming. So you can imagine that these are the craftsmen making absolutely perfect replicas of the full-size items. And you know, if you look at the fireplace, that is quite wonderful, and a lot of them will have actually been made out of the materials that the full-size items were made out of as well. So that has been painstakingly put together. If you actually wanted to see more of that, you can actually visit the National Trust website and click on Nostell Priory, and they actually have a wonderful little video that actually takes you around the house, the miniature doll's house. I mean, you can probably see the full-size property as well, but obviously that is quite amazing, and a real, I think, a real little treasure. As I mentioned just before, our English houses were known as baby houses, and that is because they obviously had the frontage of a proper house. So we don't call them baby houses now, they're back known as doll's houses. And as I've looked through all my books, I can't actually see where the crossover is from baby house to doll's house, but there must have been a crossover somewhere. I would think probably it was going into the 20th century. And as I mentioned before, they were all sort of locally made by craftsmen, handyman and estate workers, and the architectural frontage of the house was probably one of the most important features after all the decorative interior. Early dolls' houses, as I've mentioned before, were not used to be played with. They were commissioned by adults, but they were used to train young girls to run a household. And many of these dolls' houses, as you can see from this Nostell Priory one, were very large and elaborate, and most of them have been treasured over the decades. It's likely that when the young girls were being trained on house management, they were only allowed to look at the dolls' houses and not touched, which does seem a bit of a shame, really. So I'm not quite sure. I would think you could probably just go around a house and in a full-size house and into each room and see what's going on. So I can't quite understand why they had to make replicas of them to show these young girls how to run a household. It seems a bit strange to me. I don't know if anybody agrees with that. But obviously, during all these, as the centuries progress, sometimes it's very popular to have certain things, do certain things. And obviously, these very, very wealthy families, it was popular to own a doll's house. So it was obviously, you know, something that you did if you were wealthy and you wanted to show it off to your friends. So it doesn't seem to make sense, really. Obviously, we've talked about the Dutch, well, we've talked about the German and the English houses. The Dutch dolls' houses are sort of linked with the German houses, but what about other continental countries? Little has been shown in the French and Italian museums about with dolls' houses, and there's very little recorded or probably on display in those museums. I did actually find out that Marie Antoinette reputedly owned a doll's house. If you know your history, I don't know if anybody knows the history, I wasn't quite sure. She was born in 1755 and died in 1793. So obviously they did have dolls' houses in other continental countries, but obviously maybe they were, well, they definitely weren't as prominent as they were in Germany, and obviously they did become quite popular in England. So as I say, as they tended to grow in popularity, there was lots of trade exhibitions, and there was one in Paris which showed mid-19th century in one of the exhibition catalogues, and it showed that M. Collin made playthings and households with care, which he exhibits as models, which is sort of a bit random, really, as that's written, but obviously that means he makes models which can be used to play with. And obviously they were used for a lot of these companies would have miniature models of things if they were quite big to display in place of a very big thing which maybe wasn't as portable. But it does actually say playthings, so that's showing that obviously in Paris, sort of mid-19th century, so that's, you know, 1850s and before. So obviously dolls' houses were around the world. I read in one of the books, there was a lady, one of the books I have, I think it's Constant King, she actually collects dolls' houses, and she had some 19th century French houses, and she said even though they were very, very big, they were actually made of very light wood, which meant that they could be moved more easily. And she said even though they appeared as very thick wood, so you can imagine a great big, say 3-foot house, maybe 4 or 5 foot tall, you wouldn't think you'd be able to move it. But she said they were actually feather light, which is quite interesting, and it does make you wonder why other dolls' houses aren't maybe as light, because obviously it worked. Whether or not the wood is a bit more perishable, I don't know, maybe not as strong, but it seemed quite a good idea to me, because obviously once you've got one of these huge dolls' houses in situ, it is very, very difficult to move then. The French dolls' houses were actually exported in some quantity, and I think probably if they were using this very light wood, then that was a great idea, because it meant that they were a lot more easy to transport. Another thing with the French houses is that they were often made in sections, so that meant that they were easily able to lift apart, and again for transportation. But what a good idea. That's something that I haven't read in any of the other books about the dolls' houses in Germany and in Britain. So I think each country has their part to play in the hobby of dolls' houses. I'll just picture 5. Picture 5. This shows a Finnish doll's house, obviously from Finland. And you can see, again, beautifully decorated. Look at all the kitchenalia in there. Look at all the pans. That's rather lovely, isn't it? And this house dates from 1895. It's very much in the style of the German dolls' houses. But you can see, again, you know, like I was saying about scale before, you can see that a lot of the things aren't actually in scale. Look at the scale of the sideboard there. Obviously, this is obviously the where the children are playing. Obviously, you can see that is quite tiny, but if you look in here, the scales are not quite as even as they are down below. And again, this is going back to, obviously, there's different people would have made things maybe in one country or in one place and had their own scale as they would obviously somewhere else. But yeah, that's very evident. Obviously, as I say, the nursery, they're a lot tinier, but obviously look upstairs as well. Even if that's the child's bedroom, it's still very, very tiny, isn't it, compared to downstairs? So again, quite interesting. But all these houses have been kept for a purpose, and they're obviously playing a part in the history, you know, of dolls' houses. We've had a chat about the European houses. What about American dolls' houses? Because Virginia and Anne will know that in America at the minute, they do sort of influence our English collecting of the dolls' houses. So America, it's important that we have a look at America. The Americans were actually very fortunate, as they had an amalgamation of tastes and skills from craftsmen from Europe that had emigrated to the States. So obviously they've got the German influence, the Dutch influence, the English influence. So a lot of the early American houses were obviously influenced by the different styles. I did have a note here to say the earliest purely American house is in the Van Cortlandt Museum in New York, dated 1744. But even so has a Dutch influence. So I don't quite know how it can say it's a purely American house. It's obviously an American structural house, but obviously there's a Dutch influence there in its style. There's a ledger in America in 1837 that shows the arrival of furniture for fitting baby houses from Germany. So obviously, again, in America, as everywhere else, it was something that was starting to become more popular. One of the differences with the American dolls' houses is that they're open at the back and you furnish them from the back rather than the front. As we've seen before with the cabinet houses and the baby houses, they open at the front and you furnish the inside. I don't quite know when the transition was from them being furnished from the back, because none of my books actually state that. I even had a look on the internet and I couldn't find that out. What I do know is that they thought it was a shame that when you actually close the front of a doll's house, obviously if it's got an exterior of a house, you can't actually see the inside. So a lot of the American dolls' houses are actually put on turntables so that you obviously see the front of the doll's house, and then you can actually turn them round and see the interior of the doll's house. In America, they're actually known as a doll house rather than a doll's house. And I believe you have to be very careful if you put in doll's house in America, because you probably get some undesirables showing up. I'm just going to take you on to photo 6. Right. So we're going back now to Europe. Now, we're detouring back. So in the early 19th century, there was a very important development in the production of dolls' houses. And this was the invention of lithography. And it meant that toys, and especially dolls' houses, could be brightened up with coloured papers printed in different designs. And this is something that the German manufacturers seized upon, because obviously they started what we know as the doll's house now, and they were at the forefront of making the doll's houses, the furnishings, and manufacturing them. And they were obviously sent all over the world, as I said before, with that little sorry, as I said before, when I obviously read out what it said in America, because I've got so many notes I can't see what I've written, but obviously they were sent everywhere. So this house in this photograph is typical of the period of the printed papers, and can you see how much brighter it is than all the other houses that we've looked at so far? And I would say probably the other houses do actually seem quite dull in comparison, whereas this is obviously the forerunner of the doll's house as we know today. The little lace curtains, brightly patterned papers, and you've got to bear in mind that this is sort of early to mid 19th century, and those colours have actually stayed like that. So the colours were colour fast. Obviously, if it'd been put in the sun, probably they would have faded. But it did actually give the houses an extra selling point because obviously they're so attractive. By the middle of the 19th century, the collectors' dolls' houses were a thing of the past, and they started to be a child's plaything. Children were allowed to rearrange the furniture and were able to enjoy playing house. It's probably noted that they probably wouldn't have been able to do this by themselves. It would have been under supervision. So they were actually still considered, whilst there was now a child's plaything, they were still considered something that you had to be very, very careful with. And obviously in the big houses, the nanny would have been there overseeing this. So it would have been supervised play. The mass production of toys meant that everything was now cheaper, and a little bit like this doll's house, smaller 4-room doll's houses were being produced, so it just made them a little bit more affordable, because obviously not everybody had money, and a lot of people during that time didn't have any money at all, so would never have been able to afford a doll's house and would have had to have just used a box. Popular doll's houses are in this style of the German Christian Hacker, and I've got some of his photos. He was well known for his doll's houses, and he did his research in England when exploring outlets for doll's houses, and copied the styles of the houses in South London. And obviously you can see again his houses are a lot brighter. They've got an attic and a little wooden balcony. So again, we're going on to the next stage of the doll's houses. Now, Christian Hacker was well known for his doll's houses, and as with everything, when somebody actually makes something that is attractive and is selling well, then somebody is obviously going to try and copy that style. So there was quite a few people that then tried to copy this style, and I think this is more like the doll's house that we know today. The proper Christian Hacker doll's houses would have had his initial CH intertwined on the shield. I'm not quite sure where the shield is, but that must be somewhere maybe on the back. It's nice there. You can see the little lamps at the front of the house. This next one is not a Christian Hacker house, but somebody has obviously tried to emulate that, and you can actually see it's not nearly as good quality as it is the Christian Hacker house. But again, it's not unattractive. It's got the little balcony, it's got the attic. If you just have a little closer look, again, what's common probably throughout all of these early dolls' houses is the kitchens were very, very well stocked with plates and pans and food and everything. You can see that the furniture looks a little bit more in scale with each of the rooms, so maybe that's helped as the centuries have progressed, that it's more of a standardized scale that people are working in. They're a little bit more used to it. They're obviously not going to be making furniture for these dolls' houses, and they're exported from Germany all over the place, and then sell furniture which clearly doesn't fit in, is too big or too small. So I think that's quite interesting. Little lace windows at the top, lace curtains for the windows. Right, there was a big difference in the production of dolls' houses as to whether or not they'd obviously been produced by craftsmen or they were produced en masse. It was quite interesting that Charles Dickens mentions dolls' houses in his book Cricket on the Hearth, printed in 1845. So I'll just leave you to have a little read through that. So obviously, if the dolls' houses are being made, this was somebody that lived in London. So if they're being made in sort of like workshop conditions in a London house, which probably wouldn't have been very big, obviously they can spend a lot more time on the houses. They've probably got all the tools. They probably under time constrictions, but obviously they commanded a larger amount of money. But they were obviously making expensive dolls' houses and cheaper dolls' houses. Whereas where they're mass produced, probably in Germany, they can obviously knock out quite a lot of these dolls' houses, because Germany is well known for its toy makers. You could probably knock out a lot of them, but obviously the quality would obviously be right down compared to what the craftsmen's dolls' houses were like. So by the late Victorian and Edwardian times, a corner of most nurseries would be filled with a doll's house. And this is a pretty stunning late Victorian doll's house. Again, imported from Germany, as many of them were, but obviously it's been decorated. If the doll's house has been imported from Germany, obviously there were people making all the contents and the wallpapers and things in Britain, so this could actually be decorated and furnished in our style. There were obviously dolls' houses made in Britain. There's not a lot really about the Victorian and Edwardian dolls' houses, but again, it's likely that they're made by local craftspeople rather than big firms. So the styles of our English homes changed, obviously, as the styles of our dolls' houses changed, obviously, as the styles of our English homes changed. As we progressed through the centuries, the arts and crafts style became very popular, obviously, in our full-size houses, and it quite heavily influenced as well our dolls' houses. Just going back to this, though, you can see the nursery. Obviously, that's got its own little doll's house in there, rather lovely. Everything's beautifully decorated. All the fireplaces would have been replicas of the time. And I think with these dolls' houses, it just really shows the way of life of that period of time that they represent. It's nice to see people in this doll's house. Not all dolls' houses have people in. Some owners of dolls' houses don't like people in. They feel that it actually takes away from the quality of the doll's house, because very often dolls, it's very difficult to make a good doll and they command quite a high price. But I think it's lovely. Obviously, a doll's house is made for people. So you can see that's quite nicely filled with lots of people there. They look, well, they almost look like little peg faces to me, but I think they are made out of porcelain. I just want to stop at this point and just show you, I'm just going to stop my share. I would just like to share with you a little bit about scales. Now, I think most of the dolls' houses that we've looked at have been 12th scale. And as I mentioned before, that means 1 inch equals a foot. We also work in 24th scale, and that means 1/2 inch equals a foot, and also 48th scale, where 1/4 inch equals a foot. So I've actually got this to show you. Have I frozen? Oh. So if you can see this here, this is actually explaining, is that showing up all right? Yeah, so this is actually explaining the scales. So this kitchen cabinet, this is a 1930s kitchen cabinet, is 1/12 scale, and as I said before, 1 inch equals a foot. The middle one is 24th scale, and 1/2 inch equals a foot, and then the smaller one is 48th scale, and 1/4 inch equals a foot. So you can imagine when these model makers couldn't get the right scale for the interiors, well, we've actually seen it on some of the examples, some of the things are way out of scale. So there had to be a time really where things became more standardized. But I think it's quite interesting looking and taking a look at the difference in the scales. Obviously now I personally work in 1/48 scale, and I work in 1/24 scale quite a lot more than I do in 12 scale. The problem with that is that people run out of room. Now, particularly if in Victorian and Edwardian times, they had these massive, massive dolls' houses. It's where those dolls' houses go as suburban homes became smaller, didn't they, as we went into the Edwardian era, 1930s era. So people couldn't really take these big dolls' houses with them so much. Houses did become smaller. So I think the thing is, all those people who are interested in the hobby and work in 12th scale, there does actually become a time where you physically can't fit any more 12th scale houses into your full-size house. So you have to go down a scale and start working in a smaller scale. So very often that means you work in this smaller 24th scale. And then when you run out of space for that, you work in 48 scale. And I've been teaching miniatures now for 25 years at least, getting on for 30. And a lot of my students, we started off working in 12th scale. Great. It's good because you can get lots of detail on the little models that you make and within the structures. Obviously, there comes a time if you're doing classes every week for several years, then you've actually run out of space. So then we went into 24th scale, which is the middle size. So if you looked at a doll's house, the 24th scale would look like 1/4 of the size because it's half the width and half the house, if that makes sense. So that becomes a little bit more manageable in storing your doll's houses. But even after another sort of 5 years of that, you've run out of room for those ones. So then we obviously had to go into 48 scale. So again, you've got to remember that that is 1/4 of the size of the other one. So it's half the height and half the width. So it's 1/4 of the 24th scale building. So that becomes a lot more manageable. So that will help explain as to what I'm going on shortly, but I just wanted to show you this now is basically what I tend to work in mostly, and this is 48 scale, and you can see from that fits in the palm of my hand. You can actually make all the contents, and that really doesn't take up too much room. So 48 scale at the minute does seem to be the way to go for people who collect dolls' houses and actually have the hobby of making miniatures. But you can still see it's got the detail in it there. I just wanted to show you one of these little houses as well. So this, again, fits in my hand. This is a 48 scale Irish cottage. So you can see how tiny this is compared to all those great big houses that we've been looking at, can't you? Just put that back. Right. So we're going now into the 20th century. I suppose you've all heard of Hobbies of Dereham in Norfolk. Probably all of us. I mean, I've sort of always known of Hobbies of Dereham. I think it's something that my dad used to talk about many years ago. But they actually advertised in the 1890s a complete doll's house kit with furniture that could be ordered by mail, which that is something very different, isn't it, to what we've been seeing previously, all these big dolls' houses, beautifully decorated. So this is making it into more of a hobby, and it's making it more affordable. We also, well, there's Hobbies of Dareham and there's Hobbies as well, and Hobbies obviously sold dolls' houses, and they actually sold the plans for dolls' houses. The Lines brothers, I'm just going to share my screen again. The Lines brothers produced houses at the end of the 19th century. And obviously, again, this hasn't got all the printing on, but it's still a lot brighter, isn't it? And it's more sort of traditional. It's a bit more of a London sort of style of house. Again, it's got the little balcony on and it's got the attics. So that was obviously very popular, and that was what sold. The reason I've mentioned the Lines brothers is because they actually became very well known during the 20th century, because they produced the popular Triangle dolls houses, which they produced between 1919 and 1971. Now, the reason I actually mentioned scale before was that the Triangle dolls houses were actually produced in 16th scale. So they actually produced their own furniture specific to their dolls houses, whereas before it was probably 12th scale-ish with the other dolls houses. So really, if you had a Triangle dolls house, then you actually had to buy their furniture. It's quite a good move, really, when you think about it, isn't it? So this photo shows some of the early Triangle dolls houses, which I think are rather nice, aren't they? You've got sort of like the Art Deco style. These are 1930s. So they're obviously wooden dolls houses, but they're well known for the metal frames. Obviously they were all painted. They had beautiful decorations on. Can you see here? You've got your garage for your car. They actually printed on sheet metal, which you can see, well, inside for the furnishings, and they actually fill the houses with plastic furniture. One of the features of the Triangle dolls houses was that they often opened in the middle, whereas previously we've seen on the cabinet houses they opened in the middle, but very often the dolls houses just had one door opening. So this is something that's a little bit different. A lot of the Triangle houses reflected the middle class architecture in each decade in Britain until 1971. So obviously that's quite a good, anybody sort of looking at the history of houses and things, if you look at the dolls houses and the dolls houses that they've made, obviously each decade is reflecting the changes. And it's quite interesting that they chose middle class architecture as well. This is another Triangle dolls house, and this was in their catalogue, 1939 to 1963. So this is quite compact, isn't it? And obviously you've got your little garage doors here, and it definitely shows that it was a plaything, I think, doesn't it? You know, there's a big difference to these houses compared to the other houses that we've seen before. Obviously, a lot of these houses, because they've been played with, there's not many in their original state. And often at a show, we get people coming and asking, do we sell 1/16 furniture and fittings, which we don't. Obviously, it is quite specialised. There is actually Celia Thomas of KT Miniatures actually renovates these Triangle dolls houses. So anybody that may possibly have one of these in their attic and wondering what they can do with it, if you contact Celia, she can renovate them to their original condition. And obviously, because she does do this, she probably gets parts from some dolls houses, of these Triangle dolls houses, that she can keep to help renovate others. So it is something that's quite specialised. And very often what happens is some people decide that they'd like to get into the hobby of dolls houses. They go out and buy themselves a cheap doll's house, very often a Triangle dolls house. They are a little bit more expensive than they ever used to be. And then they come to a show, buy furniture for it, get home and realise that they haven't looked into it properly, and they've bought a house which is 16th scale, and they now can't actually get the furnishings. So that's another trying house back to the charity shop. But it is interesting, because I think a lot of people just think a doll's house is a doll's house, and obviously it's not. There's quite a lot to consider. There was, with the popularity of these trying dolls houses, because they really were a market leader in the production of them during the 20th century. Obviously that's a big time span, isn't it? From 1919 to 1971. I think that's quite amazing. Obviously there's other people then jump on the bandwagon, because if somebody's doing well with something, you obviously try and emulate that. This is a flat pack metal doll's house, and it's by a US firm, Louis Marks, which was exported to Europe. And you can actually see, I think that's quite nicely presented, with all the furniture kits are in a nice little paper bag. Look how beautifully it's presented. I think that's really lovely. And look at the quality of the printing on the metal. I think that's quite lovely. Obviously, I don't know if there's many of these about, because again, they're played with, they're not looked after. Kids stand on them, don't they? But I think that is really, really lovely. And I think if I saw one of those, I would probably buy it and keep it if it had the packaging. But probably, like with a lot of toys, the packaging is gone and only the toy still exists. You all will have heard of Chad Valley. They, of course, started as a printing works and extended into toys, and obviously they've done a great job with that. You can see that how beautifully printed that is on the wood. I don't know if that's wood or metal, but I think that's rather lovely. Look at the little beds in there, and again you can see that that's all in scale with one another, and obviously a child's loved playing with that, haven't they? You've obviously got indoor plumbing now in these dolls houses, because as I said before, the dolls houses reflected what was actually happening during that time. So most dolls houses now will have plumbing in. This is the Swedish firm Lundy, and they produce quite a lot of dolls houses. Look how modern that is now as we're getting through that. I think these were sort of like 1950s, but that's rather lovely. And again, all these dolls houses and their interiors reflect the decades that they were made. I've got a little note here, Fisher Price. They're linked to dolls houses. They obviously began to experiment with plastic toys in 1950, and they're very, very distinctive for the bright colours that didn't fade, and they produce safe toys. And there's a photograph of a little doll's house with a handle that obviously a little child can carry around, open the doors, fill, put it back down again, take things out. So I think a lot of these toy manufacturers at some stage, even if they're not in the forefront of the doll's house manufacturing, they've all had to go. Obviously we're getting near to, I'm keeping an eye on the time. I've just included, nowadays, obviously, dolls houses are produced by big firms, they're produced by individuals, and there's still a sort of big gap. You obviously have the dolls houses, the hierarchy end. This doll's house is made by Mulvaney and Rogers, and commands a huge price of money, and it's 6.5 foot of Versailles, which it's absolutely stunning. And Mulvaney and Rogers are a really nice couple, and they're very, very well known for their beautiful, beautiful handiwork. Obviously, if you want to look more into dolls houses, there's lots of places that you can go and see the journey of the doll's house through the eras. There's some places as well that just have collections of more modern doll's houses. I've just got a little list here that we've got Horton Tower in Lancashire, which isn't too far away. They have quite a good collection. Newby Hall at Ripon. A little bit further afield, we've got Leonards Lee at Horsham. Anybody that goes to America, you of course have the Thorn Rooms in America, and that is a 1930s collection of dolls' houses that have been assembled by a group of skilled artisans. And actually all these rooms are very, very intricate, and they actually are very accurate to the period that they were made, which again, as I keep going back to, all these dolls' houses through the decades and through the centuries are accurate to that time. So the thing is, it's quite good for historians to look at. One doll's house that I haven't mentioned is, of course, the Queen Mary's doll's house at Windsor. Is the most beautiful, I think, doll's house ever. Obviously, it was very, very accurate to the early 20th century, and the pieces are made by the best. The doll's house was designed by Edwin Lutyens, and as I said before, is an actual accurate historical model of the early 20th century. It actually had a miniature Rolls-Royce. It has a miniature Rolls-Royce motor car. There's coopers of Oxford marmalade, Rowntree sweets. It's got working running water, working lifts, electric lights. So the thing is, that is the best. And I think if you want to, after this talk, want to go and see something, that is the doll's house that you actually want to go and look at. So I realise now I'm running out of time, and I thought I'd have loads of time. I had got a little bit more to say, but obviously maybe that's for another time. Is there any questions?
Okay, everybody can unmute. Thank you very, very much for that. It was a brilliant talk. It was really
Oh, I'm
enjoyable.
sorry, I get a bit tongue-tied. It's about, I've got so much written down, and normally I would do, if I was doing a talk, it would be off the cuff and I would have things to show. So it's very different from how I would normally give a talk on miniatures, because I don't normally do about the history. So I'm sorry if I was a bit tongue-tied at
Not
times.
at all, no. Can I just start off? Can I just start off the questions asking,
yeah,
how popular is a doll's houses nowadays? And
well,
are they less sort of gender orientated, if you see what I mean?
yeah, I think dolls' houses are popular. I don't think they're quite as popular with children. I think the original dolls' houses were collected by adults, and I think it's gone back to more adult dominant in dolls' houses. There's a lot of people make dolls' houses and models as a hobby, a bit like Virginia and Anne. So it is actually considered a hobby, just like needlework, patchwork, painting. So it's actually, there's a lot going on around the country and around the world. There's workshops, fairs, I teach classes. So a lot of people that, you know, are collecting miniatures now do tend to be adults, but you do still get children that want to play with the dolls' houses. But I think now we're dominated with iPads and iPhones and lots of games on computers and things. So whereas years ago, everybody wanted, all the little girls wanted a doll's house, and little boys, because you can castle, you know, you've got your castles and forts and all sorts of things like that. You know, I don't think they're not as desirable as they used to be really for children, but children do still play with them. And regarding gender sort of neutral, there's actually quite a lot of chaps that I have that buy my furniture kits from me. So I think if you have an interest in architecture, model making, as a lot of men do, because don't forget they have their model railway, they have, like, you know, the airfix planes. You know, men have always had an interest, haven't they, in models. So I think dolls' houses fit in perfectly to anybody really that wants to be creative.
I'm just sort of wondered what so many people feel a joy in seeing a little tiny representation of something.
Yeah.
And other people really don't. And I just wonder what that's about in some way.
I think it's because you're still a child at heart, Virginia.
Yeah. There's just something, for me, there's just something wonderful about seeing something of that size that represents something full size.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I've got a friend who just can't stand it. Just
Jane, can you, I think you should tell us about the business that you've started up on the basis of this.
Really. So I started sort of dabbling in decorating little boxes and mirrors and things. And I actually did a teddy bear's picnic out of clay on a little box, the clay that I made the buttons with. And the obviously I put food on, and I went to a craft fair at Stockport, and this guy came along and he said, do you know that you can actually buy metal plates for this food? So that's actually meant that the plates I'd made were completely naff. So he said to me, you need to go to a doll's house fair. So I went to a doll's house fair the next weekend. Absolutely was gobsmacked that, like you've said before, basically, I think Virginia said anything that you can get in full size is perfectly replicated in miniature. And that really just started me off. I started the Poynton Doll's House Club, which Virginia and Anna are in. I started teaching classes for people to make miniatures, started selling my work at fairs, got a website, and it's sort of like gone on from there, really.
Anita has asked, can you show us any furniture that you or Virginia have made?
Yes, I've got all sorts of things here. Well, I mean, over the years, we've done all sorts of things, really. These are just some little bits. This is like a little, as we've been discussing dolls' houses, this is like a little wooden pram, and this is 12 scale, and the wheels go round. So this is a replica of an early pram, and this is one I've actually written 4 books on making miniatures. So this is one of the projects in my toys and games book. This is quite a nice little, I get a bit bashed. This chair's based on an Irish chair. So the bars are wire, so the bottom bars are wire, painted, cake wire. And with miniatures, you can use all sorts of materials to make them with. The washboard, anybody that does crafts, this is the ribbled card that you use in craft making that's been painted. So you wouldn't really know that, would you? I obviously love doing a little bit of printing. I love reducing things down and making them in miniature. So you've got your little box of rinso there. Sheets and things, it's just obviously fine lawn cotton you can fold over. I don't know if you can see, the seat is actually made of thread, just wound round. So this is obviously, seats are very fancy now, aren't they? But this was just an early seat that's wound round with thread one way and then the other. So that was just replicating that. So again, this is 12th scale.
How long would it take you to make something like that?
Well, it takes, the problem is if you're cutting it out, obviously it takes you a while, then you've got to paint it and then assemble it. So you're talking hours, really. Sometimes you can make a full-size thing quicker than you can make a miniature. This is like a little French blackboard, which I sell as a kit, and people buy and they put it in cafes. They're little miniature cafes. They can, have you seen the little gel pens that you can get from places like Smith's, and they're all different colours? You can get white gel pens. So people paint these and then they can write in white gel pen what they're selling in their miniature cafe. So there's all sorts of ways around these things. Now this is a utility drop leaf table for anybody that's old enough to know about that. Obviously you've got your fruit bowl on the top there. I was lucky enough, I used to do shopping for a lady. Sadly she's passed away now, but she had quite a lot of utility furniture. So when I was working on a 1930s house project, I was able to go around with my tape measure, measure up all these items, and then reproduce them in miniature. So she actually left me her full-size drop leaf table because I was so thrilled with it. So it's now my workshop. But you know, everything, I particularly like the history on the things that I'm making, and I always try, Virginia and Anne will tell you, I always try and look into what I'm making to make sure that it's historically correct. And I think from like Anne and Virginia's point of view, when you're making something, You don't want somebody to present a project and say, this is what you're making. You actually need to know about the era or the style that you're working with. So whenever we have a class and it's something that is historical, normally we'd spend the first lesson actually looking at the history surrounding the project that we're making. This is quite interesting. I have a wonderful woodcutter called Bob, who cuts all my wood for me. Obviously, when I started going smaller and doing the 48th scale and 24th scale, it becomes a lot more difficult if you're working with a saw. When you're making something very, very tiny, when you're making something very, very tiny, if Bob was to cut it on his saw, then obviously he would chop his fingers off. So that is a 48th scale cabinet. Well, it's a bread cupboard, it's a Dutch bread cupboard. So the thing is to try and cut out those little tiny pieces there, which are probably, say, 6mm by 5mm, those little draw pieces. It does become very tiny, and there's the probability that if he's not careful, he could, you know, chop one of his fingers off. This again is quite tiny. This is a little rabbit hutch. You see how tiny that is? So if I was to get Bob to do that, then, you know, he may not have no fingers left at all. So I actually had to buy a laser cutter, and the laser cutter means that you can cut these very, very tiny pieces without the bother of sort of causing myself or Bob any harm.
I think, Jane, we better leave it there. It's quite remarkable, the things that you're doing, and it's been really, really good. Could everybody try and give a round of applause if you can do that?
Thank you.
Virtual, in case of a lot of people. So thank you very, very much indeed.